Here we go, Adrian. Wonderful to see you again. I don't even remember when I last saw you, and I also don't remember when I first saw you. But it was a long time ago, I think.
I was wondering about that actually earlier on. I think it was definitely via our mutual friend Tony Levin, and it was either whilst you were part of Stickman,
Mhm.
or it would have been backstage at a King Crimson concert. I can't remember which.
When did you start doing merch for Crimson?
Well, I was kind of doing merch and tour managing as well. The short run in America in 2008, I think it
Yeah,
was,
yeah, that's where we
which
met.
was, yeah,
That's where we
which
met.
was Adrian Ballou, Tony, Robert, Gavin Harrison for the first time, and Pat. So yeah, it was probably on that run. Yeah, which was a wonderful little run of shows, and it's a pity that that lineup didn't go on to anything else.
Yeah, it was sort of like a really kind of like almost like an in-between world kind of
It was,
experience,
yeah,
though, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and like that they had like these rehearsals after the 2003 band fell apart. They had rehearsals with Tony and Adrian and Pat and Robert as a
yeah,
as a quartet,
yeah,
and nothing ever came out of that. But I have a tape of the rehearsal session, and
wow, yeah,
it's pretty interesting. There was like some cool, potentially cool material there, and uh,
yeah,
and so it was kind of like, I mean, yeah, I enjoyed the shows, but I would have liked to hear some new material at that point. But then obviously
yeah.
that didn't happen, and that was the 40th anniversary tour.
It was, yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I say that was, we started in, I think we did rehearsals in Nashville and we did the warm-up shows in Nashville.
Mhm.
And then it was a relatively short run. I think we did Chicago, Philadelphia, and then we finished up with, I think it was 3 or 4 nights in New York, which were fantastic. Those shows were absolutely great. And I know the band were on a real high after it. But as these things happen or don't happen, that
Exactly.
lineup was not meant to be any more than that. But yeah.
So were you also working with Porcupine Tree before
Yeah, I
2008?
mean, basically my background is I've sort of led 2 lives in terms of jobs. When I left university, I went into IT and worked on big IBM mainframe computers doing systems programming. I did that for many years. Ended up working for a sort of consultancy company, going around various customers, Ford and some of the government contracts in the UK and all sorts of things. And then the company was sort of taken over and restructured. And despite my sort of branch being one of the highest revenue earning branches, we got cut because it didn't fit with the new image.
Mhm.
So out of the blue, I was out of a job, totally unexpected. Luckily, walked back into a very similar job with a different consultancy. But going through that, and this was around early 2000s, made me think, well, do I actually want to wear a suit and tie and sit behind a desk and drive in rush hour traffic and give most of the money that I earn to the company that is above me? And I thought, I don't know whether I do or not.
Mhm.
So over the next few years, I'd always sort of, I've been an amateur drummer myself, and I'd always sort of put on concerts and various bits and pieces in that world. And then chatting with people, and I sort of said, like, I'd really like to move into that live touring world if I could.
Mhm.
And then because I'd come from a drumming background, I managed to get some work with as drum tech initially, and was lucky enough from sort of word of mouth recommendations to work with some fantastic players. I don't know if you know Andy Gangadine, who's played with Massive Attack and loads and loads of people. And Andy's such a lovely guy and an amazing player, using hybrid kits of acoustic and electronics and samples and one thing and another.
Mhm.
Amazing player. And from that led on to working with Steve Hogarth's band, the H Band, and then via that into Porcupine Tree. Basically, I started as Gavin's drum tech.
Oh, I didn't know.
Um,
Yeah.
And then this was around the time of the second leg of the tours for In Absentia. And they said, would you mind like selling a few T-shirts and CDs before and after the gig as well? I went, oh, that's fine. That's fine. I enjoy meeting people and whatever. And after that first run at the end of, I think it was 2003, I sort of said to the guy, I said, like, you could make so much more revenue with your merchandise because you've got fans that if you've got a good product, they will buy it. So really sort of grew that both online and at concerts over the next few years to the point where that got so busy I couldn't look after Gavin properly anymore. So I had to sort of relinquish my drum tech duties. And then with PT, did odd bits, standing in for the tour manager on a couple of short runs and odd shows here and there as well. So it's kind of been my work in the music industry. I've never been snobbish about it. If a job comes in and it's looked interesting or it's an interesting artist, so whether it's drum teching or merchandise or tour managing, I really don't mind any of those or mixing and matching them. And then with merchandise initially, got to work with Steve Hackett from Genesis around about 10 years ago now, and then for the last 5 years my primary role has been tour managing Steve's tours around the world. And we were in the middle of a US run March last year when the world went crazy and we flew home 48 hours later.
Yeah.
So I'm just back I've had my second AstraZeneca jab this afternoon.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sort of hoping that, the vaccine rollout continues and that really with the relaxation of the rules that people don't go crazy and aren't silly and still maintain sort of, do the social distancing and do the masks because it does make a difference. So that hopefully by the autumn, we can start doing some live shows again because it's been a long time.
So having come from an IT career, did you ever look back?
Oh, no. No, when I think of the miles that I used to put in driving to and from clients and then having to put an 8-hour day in. And at the time, it was good. I had some lovely clients that I worked for and have some friends in that world to this day. But in terms of the, driving, for a long time, I was driving between like 4 and 6 hours a day to and from, and then doing a full day's work as well. So that side of it, and wearing the penguin suit and the tie, I don't miss that either.
But somewhat like, since you said you got into merch by accident in a way, but then you were making suggestions that were sort of coming from a business standpoint. So you must have had some sort of business sense.
Well, I never class myself as a salesperson, because what I class a salesperson is someone that can sell anything to anybody.
Okay.
With me, it's always a case of I've always viewed, like doing tour merchandise, I viewed it from a fan's point of view, because I've been that fan. I've queued up and bought a Rush T-shirt or a Genesis program or whatever in the past, and tried to approach it from a fan's point of view. What do they want to see? And it was very much a case of, if it was me, I don't mind paying an extra few pence or whatever to know that the T-shirt's good quality, that it hasn't come from a sweatshop somewhere in the Far East, that the dye's good, it's been, ethically produced and whatever, and it's good quality. I'm happy to pay a bit more. So always erred down that side of quality, something that's going to last and something that's a good memory of a concert, really.
And as a fan, you would also kind of know what kind of content, what kind of albums or special editions people really would want to buy at a show, which sort of is, yeah. So So like you were the first person that I talked to in this series who suggested a title for the episode even before we recorded it. So that's and you
Well,
said
for anybody watching or listening, we batted a few messages to and from this week, and one of the ones that you suggested, Marcus, was, well, how about your record collection?
yeah.
As a theme or a springboard for jumping off from. And I went, oh, that's a great idea. Because for the last at least 45 years, record stores or record shops have been my happy place. I can always have fun and enjoyment, and whether I end up buying anything or not, I'll enjoy that experience. And what you see behind me, which is, I think, about 1,000 albums now. That's record collection point 2, because the collection that I built up from when I was started at secondary school or high school, grammar school in 1973, up to probably about 1990, I foolishly, and I know I'm not the only person to do this, thought vinyl's dead. There's so much I can't buy on vinyl anymore. Around sort of 89, 90s, like Frank Zappa was issuing loads of stuff, and it was all just on CD. So I sort of foolishly made that decision. Right, done. I'm going to sell my vinyl collection. I'm going to sell my record player. I'm going to spend that money on a better CD player and more CDs, which is what I did. And sort of regretted it on or off, and as time went on, regretted it more and more, up to the point where I think it was about 2006, where I was with Andrea, my partner, who's now my wife. I'd given up smoking. I'd smoked for quite a long time. And over that year, I'd given up smoking. Andrea said, look, you keep on about a record player again. The money that you're saving, not buying cigarettes every day, spend it on a record player and some records. And whilst it's definitely the healthier choice, I don't know financially if that worked out or not. So as I say, this is second record collection, and it's all stuff I listen to. I tend not to. I don't buy to invest, and I don't buy for the sake of having a particular item. I always think, if it's not something you're actually going to play and listen to, let somebody else enjoy it. Let another fan have it who would appreciate it. So it's all stuff I listen to. Although I tend to find listening to an album, both sides of an album on vinyl, it to me is the most rewarding musical experience. That's not to say I don't appreciate that digital music can sound fantastic, because I've probably got around about 3,000 albums of CD rips or high-res downloads on a server. And some of those do sound better than the vinyl, and sometimes the vinyl sounds better than the digital. So it's never a clear-cut thing. But yeah, when we sort of said, oh, well, let's use records as a springboard, I spent an enjoyable few hours yesterday digging through the racks behind me. And to my right down here, I've got a pile of records, which is I sort of divided up into what were some of the very, very first albums that I bought back in, say, starting in 1973. And subsequently, years after that, what did I sort of pick up when it was this whole sort of really exploring what we then classed as serious music, as opposed to the pop music that you got on Top of the Pops each week. And then some bits and pieces that I've picked up on tour. I'll come on to that later. And then I thought we could finish up with the last few things that I bought on vinyl as well, if that's okay with you.
So one thing that I know, because you sent me the names of those first 5 albums. So you've come full circle working with Steve Hackett, and one of your first records, right?
One of my very first albums I bought was this one, Genesis Live. And this was like, it was really intended as a stopgap album. between Foxtrot and Selling England by the Pound. Selling England came out within a month or two of me buying this album. But I mean, what a fantastic introduction to sort of progressive rock music, you know. The start of Watcher of the Skies, what an opening for a concert. That sort of the keyboard intro on that and the gradual build of wow. And I say these first few albums would all have been things that I'd bought in September through to December 1973 when I started grammar school, and suddenly discovered there was more to music than Top of the Pops and Slade and T-Rex and people like that. And you'd see people walking about at school with albums like this and Fragile by Yes and Metal by Pink Floyd. You know, all these strange images on the cover, and people had little metallic pin badges with like the Van de Graaff generator logo on or something. And it was really a case
which city did you live in back then?
I was born in Birmingham, and for the first part of my life lived in the West Midlands. So this was around Dudley, Rowley Ridges, quite an industrial area, which is known as the Black Country, not far away from Peaky Blinders land. And in fact, lots of the Peaky Blinders is filmed very close to that area. Lots of it is filmed at the Black Country Museum. And so it was kind of say at school at that time, you were sort of in two camps musically. You were in like the pop music camp, which I say was Slade and Sweet and Mark Bolan. And typically if you had an elder brother, you were into the serious music of Pink Floyd and Yes and Genesis, Jethro Tull. Now, I didn't have a brother, I was an only child, but my friend had an elder brother. So via my friend Fred, his brother used to introduce us to these fantastic things. And I say up till that point, it was in the UK, there was only 3 television stations. So everybody on a Thursday evening, all families tended to watch Top of the Pops, which was the hit single chart. But then I learned that late night on BBC Two, there was this thing called the Old Grey Whistle Test. And it was the Old Grey Whistle Test that introduced me to Genesis, and I went out and bought this album.
I see.
And there, seated down is I'm trying to think if he's on here. So, very dark in the corner there is Boss to Be Mr. Hackett. Yeah.
So live albums back then in the 70s, I was too young to know, but were they considered to be lesser albums than studio albums, or were they? Do you remember that?
There was a kind of thing of they were stopgaps whilst there might have been a change in lineup, or it was taking longer than planned to write and record the next album. So sometimes things came out of stopgaps. I mean, the other ones around that time, a few of which are on the racks behind me, is Deep Purple Made in Japan. Massive album at that time. And I think with certain bands, and I'd probably put Deep Purple as one of them, I don't know whether any of the studio albums properly captured the energy of that band as Made in Japan did. I'm trying to think of a few other examples.
There's the Peter Frampton album, right?
Yeah. There again, enormous in America. I mean, a big hit in the UK as well. The Frampton Comes Alive thing. Cheap Trick at Budokan, which I love Cheap Trick and got into them around the time of that. And it was never intended as an album. It was meant as a Japanese promotion record that then somebody in America started playing, and everything started selling out. All the import copies started selling out. So it was released in America. Then the following year, it's released in the UK. And I saw that tour, which was fantastic. But yeah, I think there was to a certain extent, they were seen as stopgaps or fillers.
When did you start drumming?
Pretty soon after, probably 1974. So around pretty early on, because from that point where I started discovering this world of music, it became the most important thing to me. And the thought of actually being in a band and making music with other people was fascinating. And there were quite a few. I couldn't sing. Once my voice had broke, I used to be quite good at young school choirs. I was very good. Once my voice broke, I can't hold a note. So I couldn't sing. There were quite a lot of other guitarists and bass players around. Keyboards looked way too hard work. Drums. There was only one other drummer in the entire school. So you were in demand if you were a drummer. So that's initially why I started down the route of drums.
So your parents supported you to get you to have
very much so. Yeah, you've got to have supportive parents if you're going to play drums, because you can't do it quietly.
And also the record collection. Did you earn that money yourself, or like?
That was probably mostly pocket money. But I mean, one of the other of my first albums, which is this one, definitely early drum hero Cole Palmer, because I bought this album there again late 1973 when it first came out, and you'd read in the music papers like Melody Maker and Sounds and the NME. You know, you'd read tales of Keith Emerson attacking his keyboards with knives, and these massive banks of analog synths that he had behind him, and Greg Lake standing on his Persian carpet that the roadie would hoover before they came on stage. And then at the back, you had Carl Palmer with this massive custom-built stainless steel drum kit and gongs behind him. And it's just like, wow, in terms of a visual impact. I never got to see ELP around this era. I saw them later on, but I never got to see them around this era. But there again, it's the whole thing of it's not just the music, it's everything else. I mean, talk about a fantastic cover for one of your first albums that you buy. You've got the Geiger cover. Of course, Geiger went on to do all the sets and stuff for Alien. And you've got fold out things, you've got posters and lyric sheets inside.
Is that an original? That's the original pressing? No, you sold that, right?
I did. This isn't my original one. This is a original one. This is back when it was on. I think it was the first thing that they issued on their own label, Manticore, because it's got the. I can hold it up. It's got the album cover on there. And it was the first thing I think that they issued on under their own label, Manticore.
This was actually the first time I saw the cover in real life. Like with a fold out and like.
And then even the insert folds out as well, so it's a fantastic piece of art.
It's interesting because you seem to. Well, I know that you're like an enthusiast, right? And you still are after all these years. And now seeing that your introduction includes sort of like the full package, right? So it's not just the music; it is the packaging, it's the artwork. It is the beginnings of you becoming a musician yourself. And so everything like that happened around, I don't know, how old were you? 11, 12, 10 or something like that?
Or, 11, 12 initially, yes. Yeah.
Yes,
and just grabbing the other few that I got from that era. My first Bowie album was The Lad Insane. I think this had actually come out in the spring of 73. But then went back in the charts later in the year. And Bowie, 1973, certainly in the UK, was unbelievable level of fame, that was way, way up there. And looking back, when I was digging out and checking dates yesterday, so I bought this in probably September, October 73, just before Pinups came out. But at one point over those sort of first few months of me getting into music, Bowie had like 5 albums in the top 30 in the UK. This one, which is the most recent, but then people had gone back and rediscovered Ziggy, and then gone back from that and discovered Hunky Dory, and gone back from that and gone to Man Who Sold the World, and then back to Space Oddity. And I say at one point in autumn 73, all 5 albums were in the charts. And Bowie was another one where, throughout his career, I've sort of followed. The 90s stuff, probably not so much. I loved the Berlin trilogy. I can listen to those 3 albums over and over again.
Mhm.
Even up to Let's Dance, fantastic. Around sort of, was it Never Let Me Down was the first one. I was like, oh, no, I'm not sure about this. And then a few after that, I was kind of not so interested in. And then really got back into Bowie probably mid 2000s when the Heathen album came out. And I thought Heathen was a real return to form.
Yes. Let me show you something in response. This is the sock that I'm wearing.
Very cool socks. Very cool socks. Very cool. Talking about socks, I can't. I've got they tucked away in my bedroom next door. But on the last main US tour we did with Steve Hackett, we were invited to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland because Steve's an inductee as part of Genesis. He's got his name on the wall. So we had the VIP tour. Backstage as well, with all the bits that were not on public view and whatever. And at the end, we sort of came out through the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame gift shop. And our lovely host was still like, well, would you guys like anything from the gift shop before you go? And everybody was picking up T-shirts and keychains and this and that. And I picked up 2 pairs of socks. I picked a Beatles Yellow Submarine pair of socks and a multicolored Rolling Stones Lips pair of socks. So I went for the socks as well. So next on my pile is another late 1973 album, Band on the Run, which is Paul McCartney and Wings. And I became a big Wings fan, a big Beatles fan. But at the time, the Beatles sort of belonged to the generation before me. I have like an older cousin called Sharon, and whilst I was at high school, she was at university. And Sharon, bless her, she introduced me to so much music, and I borrowed her Beatles albums. And that's when I discovered, you obviously knew the hits, but that's when you discovered the magic that was all the rest of Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road and things like this. But in terms of the whole Beatles world, this would be the first one that I bought. And still a great album. You got the title track and Chet and stuff on there. And when you think, I think it was, might have actually been the night before they were due to fly to Lagos to record the album, 2 members of the band left. So the whole album was just Denny Lane, Linda McCartney, and Paul McCartney. I think Paul plays all the drums on this. And got to see Wings a few years later, where there again they took off and were playing like the enormous domes in America and stuff. And they came back and did a tour of relatively small theatres in the UK one year. And managed to get a ticket because obviously sold out. And by that point, I suppose I'm a pretty seasoned gig goer by that point. I'd probably been to a good few dozen concerts. But that was the one where, when they walked on the stage and Paul McCartney walks onto the stage, that was the one where I thought, wow, that's one of the Beatles up there. That was a real starstruck moment. That was a real, forget everybody else, that's one of the Beatles. And a few years ago, for a Christmas present, my wife, Andrea, kindly bought me the box set of the mono Masters box set of all the mono albums, or all the ones that were ever issued in mono. And that's one of my treasured possessions, that is, just amazing library of music. And my last one from
hey, but before you started buying those albums, like do you remember, like, was there even like a path to becoming a music fan before that, or was it?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, we had the obligatory sort of 2-tone dance set standalone record player at home. And my mum and dad had a few albums, probably like things like South Pacific Soundtrack and a few classical bits and pieces. And one way or another, either my parents or myself, we'd buy odd singles now and again. I think the first actual record I can remember spending my money on would have been Sandy Shaw, Puppet on a String 7-inch single, the year that she won the Eurovision Song Contest. And then, yeah, probably odd Beatles singles and I'm trying to think of the singles around, maybe a few of the earlier Bowie singles, Carly Simon I can remember. But it was that huge change for me, that first couple of months at secondary school, and suddenly this whole extra world just opened up of all these artists that I'd never heard of before, and fell in love with Frank Zappa and Yes, and all these incredible bands.
Yes. So was it the press that you started paying attention to? Probably not. So it must have been the other kids at school, like you were saying,
It's
that
a
they
mixture,
had.
really, because I mean, if you did, once you were into music, you usually read at least one, if not more, of the weekly music papers at that time, and there was quite a few. I tend to favour Sounds and New Musical Express for the two that I sort of read each week. Which, you know, for a long time, that was the only way that you learned about, you know, somebody was working on a new album, or somebody was going to be doing a tour, or a lineup change of a band, or anything, because this is way before internet or anything like that. So yeah, and my last one from that initial end of '73 was this album, Roxy Music. Stranded, which was the third one, the first post Eno album, but apparently Eno's favourite, although he's not on it. And this I can remember. I remember seeing them on Top of the Pops when Virginia Plain was a hit, which was obviously a standalone single. And then I think I bought the single of Pajama Rama, which was the standalone single for the second album that wasn't on the album. But then when Street Life was the main hit single from this, when Street Life came out, I'm like, wow, that's fantastic, and bought this album. And there again, followed Roxy for many years. Really, I think the first 5 Roxy Music albums are my Roxy music. I can appreciate the latter ones like Avalon and things, but for me, it was like the first album through to Siren. That was Roxy music for me. And there again, fortunate to see them a couple of times during that period. And like with Bowie, it's the stage show and the look of things as well, that, you know, you've obviously got, you know, gorgeous frontman Brian Ferry, but then you've got these fantastic backing singers dressed in matching outfits, and Phil Manzanera in some sort of glam outfit, and Andy Mackay on sax in some dapper 3-piece suit or whatever. And fairly recently, I've heard a podcast with Nile Rodgers from Chic. And Nile Rodgers tells the story that when he and Bernard Edwards were starting to put a band together, and they'd got musical ideas and stuff, but then Niall was over in London for something, and a friend took him to a Roxy Music concert. And he looked at Roxy Music, and the look of Roxy Music on stage, you know, whereas most bands at that time turned up in the jeans and t-shirts they'd worn all day, Roxy were in these fantastic, you know, sharp outfits and the backing singers and everything. And he said, like, he was like, that's what we've got to do. And phoned Bernard Edwards that night, international to America, said, I've just seen this band called Roxy Music. We've got the sound. That's what we've got to do visually. We've got to have style. Yeah. So yeah, and then following on from that, I say that period covers the first sort of 4 months of me really getting into music, and then I dug out and I discovered so many artists over the years.
Hey, so for both Roxy Music and Bowie, you said that there are like certain periods of the career where you enjoyed the music more than other parts of the career. Is there any artist where you would say you love everything that he or she or they have ever done?
Probably not. There's artists that I like most things. For a body of work, I'd still cite the Beatles. You know, from
Yeah,
start to finish, that's such a journey from
for sure.
Please Me through to Abbey Road is just, you know.
You know what it's like for me is a little bit that sometimes I can take a step back from the music, and I sort of like I'm into it because I love to experience and to see the path that the artist takes. So it's
Yeah,
sort of like yeah, maybe I don't like this music as much, or it doesn't kind of like is what I expected or expect. But then sort of like in hindsight it's always interesting to see how, like, you know, if you put it in context with a full you know, career over decades, it sort of
absolutely.
starts
Yeah,
making sense, and you can like see how like personal lives, obviously the way that life in general changes over the decades, and all these things kind of like come together in a piece of art. And then yes, sometimes like maybe there's less inspiration, or when people started using 80s technology, for example, right?
yeah,
Like things changed considerably, right?
yeah,
But and so it seems there's always just a little bit of like, you know, like there are all these influences and circumstances, and you get a piece of art, an album, right? And it's
yeah,
sort of like a product of that time as much as a product of the artist. And that's why I'm sometimes I'm pretty forgiving, you know, and I just say, okay, I understand. And I sort of
yeah,
then spent serious time kind of like maybe trying to crack that nut, you know, so to kind of like get to the core
yeah.
of.
I know exactly what you mean. I mean, talking about Roxy Music there, sometime last year I picked up a used copy of Manifesto, which was the album after Siren, after they'd done a break after Siren, and then Manifesto came. And at the time I saw the tour, I bought the album, and I was unsure about it. Listening to it last year for the first time in a long time, that really stands up. I
Mhm,
was
mhm.
really surprised at how good it was. And with the Bowie stuff, even that sort of era that I wasn't so keen on, with the last sort of couple of years, I've sort of dipped back into that. And it's like Earthling. Yeah, there's some good stuff on
Yeah.
Earthling, and Hours as well. I was surprised with.
Mhm.
But so I definitely know what you mean. I understand it. Seeing it in the context of a whole life cycle, and I agree that it's worth going back and revisiting some things as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
So my very
Good.
quick part of these, I'm going to go through these
Yeah.
very quickly because these are my other sort of the years that followed on. Just a few of the things that I discovered and still love. Little Feat. This is the last record album, which was the first Little Feat album I bought. And this is very much a case of that whole thing of, like you said, word of mouth from friends recommending it. And this was so it's like, we had this American band called Little Feat. He'd actually bought, there was a Warner Brothers sampler that was out in the UK that was like, I don't know, ridiculously cheap. It was 49p and it had 2 Little Feat tracks on it. And then read reviews of their first shows in London, where I think they were supporting the Doobie Brothers, but actually got a standing ovation.
Mhm.
And went out and bought this album, and that's remained a favourite of mine for a long time. The grooves on that was a band that you couldn't really, they didn't sit in any one category, and the songs had a wonderful vibe and feel and groove to them, which the combination of like Lowell George's writing and Paul Barrere's writing, but also Little Feat's drummer Richie Hayward was a big influence on me. I loved the way that he could take a really off-kilter, weird time signature song and make it groove.
Mhm.
I've never known anybody else quite like it. Also, Tangerine Dream. Saw Tangerine Dream very early on the Phaedra tour, actually. And there again, love the 70s stuff. After that, I kind of have to mix and match that.
Mhm.
Yes, first time I saw Yes was on the Relayer tour, which was an outdoor show. That was fantastic. And certainly around that time, the first part of the 70s, if music had very few boundaries, and the Old Grey Whistle Test was, to say, the big TV show in the UK. So as well as artists that we've talked about, they'd also put things like Bob Marley and the Wailers, which is reggae, but these were being featured on a rock program. And I was fortunate enough to see Bob Marley, not on this tour, that I saw them on the tour after this, Rastaman Vibration. Wow, that was amazing. That was at, it was what used to be a big cinema in Birmingham, the Odeon in Birmingham, which is a big 2000-ish cinema with a balcony and the stalls. And that, for a long time, that was the main concert venue in Birmingham. And for Bob Marley and the Wailers, I was sat on the balcony, and it's like the balcony is doing this to a worrying extent. Because everybody was up and dancing and whatever for the whole show, and it was like, yeah, is this okay? So I think Bob Marley was definitely the most bouncy I've ever seen at that show. Tom Robinson came a close second, and then the other thing around that time was sort of springboarding from one artist. You'd read an interview or see an interview with an artist that you liked, and they'd mention somebody else, so you'd go and investigate that artist. And a huge drumming hero of mine was Phil Collins. And Phil Collins keeps mentioning this band, Weather Report. So naturally, I went and started sort of investigating Weather Report. I think Black Market was the first album I actually bought, and then saw them on this tour, which was with Peter Erskine and Jaco Pastorius. And that was one of my
which year was that?
I can't remember. This would have been late 70s. I think the tour, this album says 79. I think, can't remember if the tour was actually 78 and this was released the following year, or if the tour was actually in 79. But that was, Weather Report was my sort of in to the world of jazz. And seeing them, and just seeing, probably more so than a lot of the rock bands that I'd seen, the interplay between the musicians, that you got these, I think it's 5 guys on stage, and there was eye contact the whole time, and they were all bouncing ideas off one another. Just absolutely amazing. I saw them later on with Omar Hakim drumming as well. And the interplay between Joe Zawinul and Omar Hakim was just joyous to watch. Absolutely amazing.
What kind of venue was it that they played in the late 70s?
In the UK, it was on that tour. It may well have been the Birmingham Odeon. So it would be, they were playing theatre type venues at that stage. And I'd say, so first half of the 70s was very much like, you could go anywhere. You could go into the world of folk and investigate John Martin and Nick Drake and Fairport and blues a little bit, and John Mayall and whatever. And then the sort of second half of the 70s was punk and new wave, which I loved and still love a lot of that music. The next one I got here was like the first Ramones album, which I bought by import. Man, I played that album to death. I think that's probably, when people say, have you ever worn an album out? I think the first Ramones one that I bought on import would be probably one of those. It's only about half an hour, and I played it over and over and over. And loved people like the Damned and Ian Dury and the Blockheads. But then you started to get this sort of situation. I don't know whether it was the same in Germany and elsewhere, but in the UK there was very much the well, if you're into the Sex Pistols and the Damned and the Ramones, that was cool, and you couldn't possibly like Pink Floyd and Genesis, because that was the term was boring old farts and old dinosaurs. You could, if you're this, you couldn't like that as well. And I was always saying to the camp, I love both. I like this new stuff, and I still love the Genesis and yes, and everything else as well. And I couldn't see why there had to be this, oh, this is cool and this is okay. And no, that's not okay anymore. But there was still some, fantastic music from that period. And then, as I say, going on through like the 80s and up to sort of like the end of the 80s was, I'd say, that point that we touched on earlier, where vinyl just wasn't being, so many albums were not being released on vinyl anymore.
So you were still buying lots of vinyl in the 80s? Or did that?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I bought a very basic CD player and sort of had a small CD collection, but if something was available on vinyl, I always used to buy the vinyl. I had a much better record player than I had CD player. But it just got to that tipping point. It's like, do I keep going with both, or do I just cut the cord and go with digital? And as I say, I went with digital. But it's that whole thing, and we talked about, you know, the gatefold covers and lyrics that you could actually read that were big enough to read, and you'd go through the liner notes as well. You'd see, well, who was the engineer on this album, and you'd pick an album cover to pieces, and you couldn't really do it with a CD booklet. And I know from Mark Wilkinson, who's a friend of mine, who was the artist who did all the Fish era Marillion stuff and did Fish's solo stuff through to the present day. And he was sort of like, you know, heartbroken. It's like, you know, back in the 70s, you were creating a 12-inch piece of art. And so much of that shrunk down to a CD cover, just does not have the same impact.
I know, but it's not as bad as not having any credits at all anymore these days, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, like for me, it was also a big part of it, like reading the liner notes and also browsing at record stores, like, you know, like that was like the main thing, right? Because like, if you know, the way it was in Germany, like you had to maybe take 3 albums and then go into a booth and ask them to play them for you, and so a lot of the browsing for me was done sort of here, right? Just reading the names, kind of making these connections. And you know, there's one story which I want to tell you, because I don't want to forget to tell you. I had a recurring dream for a long time, like maybe 10 years of my life. It was like this sort of complex of like a big department store, but it also had a swimming pool, and like there were like all sorts of ways you could get from A to B, and then there was a record store in this, you know, there, and I was always like looking for that record store in the first place. And then when I was in the record store, I was looking for what I in my dream called the Holy Grail. And I was browsing, and I remember that in my dreams I actually picked out albums. And sometimes I could, like when I was waking up, I could remember the color scheme.
Wow.
Yeah, I could remember the color scheme of the albums, and you know, now comes the really funny thing. Like that was I think that was really like my wish to discover that ultimate music that I loved, or the unreleased album by my favorite artist or something like that. But as soon as I started making my own music, that dream started. It basically stopped.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think that's a cool story, because sort of at the point when I started to make that music that I wanted to hear, I didn't have to look for it in my dreams. I was going to
say, you're working towards your own Holy Grail at that point. Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, and there's actually one, and now because there was one color scheme that I then later found in a real album, and that was Sylvian Fripp, The First Day.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I had dreamed that color scheme before that album was out, and that was interesting.
Weird. But I mean, I'm sure because what year would this be for you? Sort of 80s, I'm guessing, mid 80s.
Well, this was like the Sylvian Fripp album was in '93, and my dream.
But I was thinking when you started buying music.
When I started buying music was in '83. I bought my first album in '83. Yeah.
Yeah, '83. You're in the same position as me. You had to be careful. Music was expensive. You couldn't just go and buy things willy-nilly. Mm-hmm. So you had to do, like you said, you had to do your research in the press and whatever. And it's like, well, whose new album should I go and investigate? And what different artists should I maybe listen to? And as you said, try and find one of the stores where you could put a pair of headphones on and listen to something. And that I can remember there again, early on in my sort of, starting to read the music press and learning about all these different artists. One big leap of faith I can remember taking was Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, the first release on Virgin Records. And this was before it got known, because it was included, it was as part of the soundtrack to The Exorcist. It was before that it had been released. It was starting on, it was a very slow burner originally. It wasn't a big hit initially, but then it was that whole word of mouth. Word got out and it started creeping up slowly up the charts in the UK until it was the #1 album in the UK. And on the back of that, Virgin started taking out sort of press adverts in the music papers, Mike Oldfield. And it was like, but what is this? I've never heard of this guy before. What sort of music is it? Because none of it was played on the radio or anything, or even on Old Grey Whistle Test or anything. But it's like, it was the buzz about this album was so much that I remember, I'm going to have to buy this to hear it. There is such a buzz about this album. I need to hear it. And I can remember buying it and getting it home and having no idea what I was going to listen to. And putting it on and lying on my bed on the Saturday. I remember buying it on the Saturday morning, lying on my bed, listening to it, and fantastic. And the changes and the different sort of sections of the piece and whatever. And then, for anybody who doesn't know, at the end of side 1, you've got a wonderful person called Vivian Stanshall, who was there again, a comic hero of mine. I love Vivian Stanshall, introducing the various instruments. Now, this is probably, I don't know, 15, 18 minutes into the side 1.
Yeah.
Which has been totally instrumental up until that time. So I'm sitting, I think the house is empty. I'm lying on my bed, probably reading one of the music papers, listening to this wonderful instrumental music. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes Vivian Stanshall's first introduction. Like, I forgot what the first one is, but like 2 distorted guitars.
Grand piano,
that was it. And I jumped out of my skin, wondering where this disembodied voice had come from.
It's Oldfield's birthday today, 68. Wow. He turned 68 today. Yeah. He's only 68. Just think about that. And the album was released in 73.
Oh yeah, he was very young. Yeah.
Yeah. Who
would have thought in 1973 that would, be the backbone of a, banking world and an international airline and a holiday company and everything else.
And actually, they just announced that they're going to call the first space thing for tourists Tubular Bells. Did you see that?
No.
Yes, they are dedicating that to him, which is amazing. Oh, like the first album I bought was Crises. So that was the 10-year anniversary Oldfield album.
Yeah.
That was the first album that I went out to buy, because I wanted to buy it, and I was 9, 10. I was 10, and it was incredible. Like, I still remember that back then in the record stores, they were really if they wanted to push an album, they had walls full of posters for the release, or these I don't know how you call them, cardboard
cutouts
and figures and models and stuff like that. Yeah. Those were the days, right? That's incredible. Yeah. I mean,
for me, it's the first 4 Mike Oldfield. That's Mike Oldfield for me, up to Tubular Bells through to Incantations, and I like some of the stuff later. And then he did a tour in the UK. I don't know if it went elsewhere. He did a tour for Incantations, which was a pretty big band and orchestra. And that was fantastic. They did, I think, 3 of the 4 sides of Incantations, then the whole of Tubular Bells. And then at the time he had his disco single, Guilty, which I really like, actually.
Yeah, I love it.
I like that track. But on everybody's seat, they'd left a piece of paper or a card with instructions of how to fold this card to make a paper dart.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
there was going to be a certain point in Guilty where everybody launched their paper darts. And it
Mhm.
was such a joyous thing. This was a
Mhm.
big arena of I think probably about 8,000 people at the NEC in Birmingham. And then they had back projection as well of this glider flying. And these paper aeroplanes were just flying everywhere in the arena. It's fantastic.
Well, I really envy you, because that tour and the live album Exposed, to
Yes,
me, Exposed is one of the greatest live albums ever.
I think some of that was recorded at the show I was at Birmingham. Yeah, certainly some of
It's
the photos are definitely from there. Yeah,
it's it was, you know, in general, I think it was a great time in music, because it was just before the 80s, so just before the digital thinking started, because like
yeah,
even before it was digital technology, you kind of like, it was the thinking changed, I think, well, you know, and so like to have, you know, just the courage to go on tour with 60 people on stage, and then recording every show and all of this. This
yeah,
is just so wonderful. And you know, like then in the 80s, they went to not even record a full drum kit, but single hits and stuff like that. It's quite, you know, that must have been like really like the biggest change in how music was produced, was like the between 80 and 85 or something,
yeah.
right?
And probably again, I would say something that I'll touch on later when we go through one of my
Mhm.
recent-ish album purchases
Mhm.
uh, with broadband and the internet. The whole thing of, well, I'll do my bit and then I'll send it to Tony Levin and he'll
Mhm.
record me
Yeah, yeah.
4 different bass lines in his studio and send me back and I can pick which one I want.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to send it to somebody else to do the drums, etc. And that whole thing of almost having multiple jigsaw pieces to pick from. I'm kind of like, yes, there has been some great music made that way, and I can see certainly during lockdown for a lot of people that was the only way that music's been made, and it works for a lot of different reasons. But to me, there's always been a certain different level. And I think this is coming from maybe for us to say with weather reporting and getting into jazz and learning about sort of lots of the fusion stuff like Mahavishnu Orchestra and Brand X and Bruford and people like
Mhm.
that, but then also going off into Miles and John Coltrane and Herbie Hancock and stuff, that the jazz side had that feel of it didn't have to be bang on the meter. You didn't use a click track. It hadn't got to be perfect. You didn't need to adjust things in recordings. It was more about the vibe and the feel and the interaction between the players. And that's what's always drawn me in terms of jazz music, that interplay between the musicians.
Mhm. You see, like, I think it's not only the digital technology to blame for, you know, the fact that things have changed so much.
Mm.
It's also that just music isn't as much as a business anymore. So
Indeed, yeah.
so really, like you know about this, like for Stickman, for example, like when we tour, like we don't have money and we don't have time to rehearse even. So like we set up just like one afternoon before we start a tour, we play through the material once and that's it, you know. It's not that we wouldn't want to do it, but you know, in order to make a living nowadays as a musician, you basically have to work all the time. And
Yeah.
so any time that you spend on your art and you're not being paid, you pay.
Yes.
And it's the sad reality, right?
Yeah.
And uh, you know, and that's why, like, you know, like when do I get an opportunity to really record properly with my band?
Mm.
We, you know, when we play live. So that's why, you know, recording the live shows has become something that, and also
The
producing
subject
and
matter.
mixing the,
Yeah.
you know, mixing live shows has become something that is kind of like taken the place of making a record in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, some of that even goes back to the 70s, because I mean, a whole chunk of Zappa's catalogue
Yeah.
was basically live shows that he then took and overdubbed and split and changed and whatever. So it didn't resent. It was not a live album,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
lots of the backing tracks for the stuff that like Terry Bozzio's on and Vinnie Colaiuta's on came from
Mhm.
the nuts and, if you like, the nuts and bolts came from live performances.
Yeah. And you see, this is where I think that that's why, for me, an album that is produced entirely in the studio, or where the studio is being used as sort of a musical tool, is very valuable. So there's no judgment whatsoever that there's, like, even if you're overdubbing or whatever, like the Oldfield record you mentioned, Tubular Bells. Well, obviously has not been played live, but it's still, it's a piece of art that uses the studio to create, and that you know, and that I find fascinating. That's also why I believe that there shouldn't be, shouldn't be such a thing as people saying that something sounds natural. I believe that a recording can never sound natural, because it's a recording. No matter how hard you try to capture the natural sound, it really isn't, right? And you kind of like, and music technology, even early music technology, has kind of shown that you have to sort of artificialize some elements for them to sound real on the recording, like, like adding saturation to a bass or to the voice or whatever, to kind of like, and anyway, I don't even know how I got here, but I'm just saying, like, there's as a creative tool, I think studio technology is amazing, and like that there are bands, and you probably have good examples where bands sort of like produce an album, and then like they're being forced to kind of like reproduce it live, and they actually take the challenge and they become a better band because of the right.
Well, I'm skipping ahead now. So
Yes,
I'm
what do you
skipping
have
into my because it touches on two things that we've just mentioned in
Yeah.
some of my recent purchases. One, which was tailored to last year, is this Bruce Springsteen's last album, Letter to You, which I think is absolutely incredible. I was a big Bruce Springsteen fan, late 70s, 80s, up to River and Nebraska and things like that, and lucky enough to see him on the River tour. After that, could take or leave him for a lot of the time. He's the biggest Bruce Springsteen, I suppose, was Born in the USA, which is probably my least favorite Bruce Springsteen album. But this one came out and was recommended, and I gave it a listen, and it's fantastic. And it's really with everybody in the studio. It was done just over a week, I think. And it's got that wonderful vibe of like a group of old friends getting together to make music again. And obviously some great selection of Springsteen material for them to work with. But that's sort of going back to that old school thing of everybody's in the room at the same time making the record. And I think that worked really well on that. And as you say, it hasn't always got to be like that, but I think it brings a certain magic having the musicians together to make the music. And when you were talking about the recording technology and how that's changed, and how no recording can really sound natural, one of the other things I've been purchasing recently is Blue Note Records has been doing a fantastic classic vinyl reissue series. And they're doing, I think, a couple of classic albums every few months. And there again, if you think about when these were recorded, this is Rudy Van Gelder was the engineer on most of these. And the equipment they had at the time, the sound is incredible. And it's, it really was back then, a producer and especially a recording engineer really earned their money, because to get an album sounding as fantastic and as real life as this, with the equipment that was in, and likewise, you listen to some of the Frank Sinatra and Nelson Riddle orchestra things when they were recorded, how basic the recording equipment, and it was like a lot of it was done on probably 2 tracks, 4 at most, and yet they managed to capture that magic. So yeah, I know what you mean, but I'm really the same as you. I think there's certain magic to be had in people making music together at the same time. It doesn't have to be like that, though. Both worlds can coexist. Another album I bought tail end of last year, which is a name you'll definitely know, but was new to me until last year, is a gentleman from the northeast of England, Ian Boddy, who I hadn't heard of until a good friend, Stephen, recommended this to me last year. And he said, like, well, I know you love like the 70s Tangerine Dream. Have you heard of Ian Boddy and Din Records? And I was like, no. Right. And he sent me a load of links. And this one here is Ian's last solo studio album, Axie, which is a wonderful record. And I know you've done several collaborations with Ian over the years. And you know, this brings me on to something else that you touched on, is how as fans we can help artists that we love keep making music. And this one, this album is something I purchased via a thing called, if probably most people have heard of it, called Bandcamp. Maybe not everybody has heard of Bandcamp. But Bandcamp is basically an online, I suppose it's a store for both digital downloads, but also you can order physical things from them as well. But unlike most of the streaming services, they try and get as much of the revenue to the artist as possible. Which I think is fantastic. And over lockdown as well, they did this thing called Bandcamp Fridays, where basically they waived all their fees. So if you bought an album for $12 from an artist, that artist received your $12, yes. Which for so many artists at the moment, especially independent artists, was such a lifeline. So, you know, if anybody watching or listening to this hasn't gone and browsed Bandcamp, do so, because there's so much fantastic music on there, and it's people who deserve the income. And like I said, that Bruce Springsteen one, that one is one of, if you can't buy from the artist or you can't buy from a merch stand at a concert, try and support your local independent store. One of the things, we've been up here on Orkney 4 years now and love it more and more every day. And we're incredibly fortunate that on Orkney we have a great record store called Grooves. And I'd be lying if, when we were deciding should we move up here or not, I would be lying if the fact that there was a really good record store didn't sway me slightly.
Hey, so, and Orkney Grooves is the record store that you bought it from, right? Because I was wondering, because you sent me this list and I was wondering if that was the label. But which label is the Springsteen record on?
Old Springsteen's still on the major label. I think it's CBS, which is now owned by Sony, because that's the other thing in terms of the music world that we live in these days. There's Sony and there's Sony, Universal and Warner Brothers, and that's about it. Everybody else is owned by them. So yeah, I would encourage people, go and look at Bandcamp, or if you go to a gig, buy something from them, or if you can't, go to your local independent record store. And I think I read, there's a fantastic thing I read on Facebook around the time of the last Bandcamp Friday, where somebody had actually worked out that if you went and bought one album from an artist on Bandcamp, the revenue that reached the artist was the equivalent of you playing their music every day for 2 or 3 years on a certain streaming service.
Yes.
That's how little revenue the artists get from these streaming services. And it's something that I think, you know, in the UK over the last year, there has been some of the artists that I've worked with in the past have been, you know, waving flags and making noise that, you know, that this can't go on, because it could kill, you know, so many independent artists could just go, you know what, it's not worth it anymore.
But, you know, let me add to that, because even or not even, so especially if you don't need physical product, you know, buy the download. That really is really should be the message as well, because if you buy the download, you know that you own it and you can listen to it like 5 million times and
Yeah.
you've spent your nine pounds, right, or something like that, right?
Exactly. So if Spotify were to go bang tomorrow,
Yeah.
where's all your playlists disappeared to? They've gone.
Yeah.
And the other great thing that I found with Bandcamp as well, I'm a great believer in trying to get as most out of the music as possible. So there again, from sort of like a teenager on, I've been interested in hi-fi and trying to hear as much as possible of what was put in, what the artist put into that recording. So when for a time before CDs came along, you had cassettes were battling and overtook vinyl sales in the UK for a while. And it's cassettes that are dreadful.
Mm.
And it's like, here we are in current day, and it's why are we putting up with MP3s?
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason.
Yeah.
With storage so cheap on phones, Wi-Fi speeds so fast, there's no need for MP3s, which is compressed down so much. And one of the great things with Bandcamp as well is you can have an MP3 if you want an MP3, but you can have a FLAC file if you want a FLAC file.
Exactly.
So yeah. And one of the other things there again, a recent purchase, this again was through Bandcamp, is this album. This is a guy who was originally from Orkney, a guy called Erlen Cooper. And Erlen Cooper's music it's one of those which is difficult to define because he's almost a composer more than a musician, although he does play quite a few instruments on the albums, but he'll also have lots of guest artists on the albums. He'll have guest vocals on the albums. Quite often he will incorporate either natural sounds such as bird song and the sound of the sea and the ocean. He'll incorporate that as well, and spoken word clips and samples as well. And he's done a whole, I think, a triptych of albums, and I think this is the last of the trio, based around Orkney. The photo on the front is one of the old crofts, could well be very close to where I'm sitting now. So if you haven't discovered Erlen Cooper, I would encourage you to. He's on Bandcamp, and there's lots of samples to try. In the UK, BBC Six Music, which is the station I listen to most over here, they picked up on it and had it as one of their albums of last year and gave it a lot of airplay. So Erlen Cooper, and there again, that was one where I bought the download, and then this is a nice vinyl as well. So I bought the vinyl from Bandcamp as well.
Fantastic. Hey, so in your travels, did you find any gems when you were out on the road?
Oh, definitely. I mean, once I got back into record collecting, as I say, around second half of 2006 and the years following, I was kind of ahead of the curve because vinyl hadn't become trendy again at that point. Vinyl was still on the decline at that point. The sort of resurgence hadn't really happened. So certainly for the first few years after I got it back into vinyl, there was very definitely bargains to be had on my bits and pieces I've got next from the road, because it was one of those things. I say, like, record stores have always been a happy place for me. On the rare occurrences we have a day off on a tour, or half a day off, or even a couple of hours, some people will go sightseeing and others will go and visit the local bars. Me, I'll Google best local record store and take myself off. And that's my way of, like, I'm a great one for lists, and especially doing tour management. I've got endless to-do lists categorized, and that's a way of leaving all the to-do lists to one side for a few hours, just concentrate on crate digging and browsing. And to say, there was great bargains I picked up early on tours. This one was from, I think this was when I was out with tour managing one of Stephen Wilson's side projects, Blackfield, and we did a short run in America. And this was a record store which I don't think is there anymore, in Boston, close to the Berklee School of Music, that I happened on purely by chance. And I was just out walking and happened upon this store that was completely disorganized. So it was a true crate digging journey. You just had to sit and plow through it. But this is pretty much a mint copy of George Harrison's first post-Beatles solo record, All Things Must Pass, which is a triple album. And I think I picked it up for like $8 or something. And it's a wonderful thing because it's a proper box set and you've got the individual records inside. And the third album is sort of studio jams, the Apple Jam thing, which doesn't get a lot of play. But in terms of the proper studio tracks on this album, you realize what an underused writing resource George Harrison was in the Beatles.
Yes.
Because there's so many fantastic tracks on that. So that was an early on bargain. One of the places, if I'm out in California, I always try and get to Amoeba Records.
Yeah.
There's a big one in San Francisco, I've been to several times. Huge one in LA, which has just moved very recently, and I haven't obviously been to the new one. It's opened during the whole COVID thing that they moved. But it kind of harkens back to your dream, because if you walk into Amoeba Records in LA, certainly in the old one, I'm sure it's the States have played with the new one too. And the last time I was there, or one of the recent times I was there with another co-friend of ours, Sid Smith, the writer. And I went out from there and took Sid and whatever, probably on one of the King Crimson runs. Amoeba Records give you a map when you walk in the door. That's my sort of record store. You need a map to find your way around. So a real bargain. I picked up a load of bargains from there, but this one, Lost Lobos, if you remember one of their early albums, How Will the War Survive? This is $1.99. So that was a real bargain. But even so, I tend to find, I say I'll do this wherever we happen to be in the world on tour. America tends to be probably more of a chance of finding bargains. In the UK, the prices of lots of secondhand vinyl has sort of risen over the last 10 years or so. Germany, Berlin, you have some fantastic record stores in Berlin. Especially, can't remember, you'll probably be able to tell me the name. Last time I was there, and I only had a couple of hours and took myself out, and it was a store very much focused on electronica and ambient. I can't remember the name of it, but if you're into that world, you were in heaven.
Yeah.
So I say a lot of the ones I picked out are more America, because America tends to they work on the, sell it cheap and keep the units moving, keeping the stock fresh. So on one of the Steve Hackett ones, we were in Ithaca, which I think is in New York State, which is a lovely little sort of university town in America. And they just had in, I bought these for, I think it's $5 each, John Barry's James Bond soundtracks. So you got Diamonds Are Forever, You Only Live Twice, and Goldfinger. They're all absolutely fantastic. James Bond movies of the 70s would not be the same without John Barry's music in the background. So they're all fantastic. Going back to my thing of like just Googling best local record stores, this was on a different Steve Hackett tour. As this one, it's like, oh, people were recommending this place. Okay, so I get a taxi out I've got a couple of hours one afternoon, took a taxi out. So this is on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, this place called Jerry's Records. So I have the address and I get a taxi, and taxi drops me at this address, and I get out and I'm like, there's like a radio repair shop there, and there's a laundrette or something, and there's just a doorway with Jerry's Records above it. I'm like, oh, have I done the wrong thing here? It's going to be, okay, I'll look while I'm here. Walk up the stairs, and it's an Aladdin's Cave, all used vinyl, all secondhand, pre-loved, absolutely enormous. You can't believe it. And every time, I've only managed to get back there, I think once or twice since, but they have a massive, massive jazz section. Lots of the German ECM label. I'm a big fan of ECM releases, and they tend to be, I don't know whether the American distributor was very free and easy with promotional copies, because lots of the ECM ones I bought in America have got the promotional silver stamp on them. but way cheaper, certainly than you can buy them in England or Germany. But they're on about just odd things that you can find out to do. And this was at the Jerry's one, which was this. And this was, I think it was $2 or $3, which is a female artist who was first well known in the 1970s, Judy Zook, who was signed to Elton John's Rocket Records initially. And it's a test pressing for an album I already had, her first album, Welcome to the Cruise. Wonderful album. Some beautiful songwriting, and she's got a real fantastic band on it as well. But this my copy of my proper copy was probably a 1980s mid-price reissue, and it's quite flimsy, and it's a really well recorded album. And this test pressing that I bought for say $2 or $3 must have been for the American release of it, and I would guess dates back to the 70s. And the difference in sound quality between those two pressings is amazing. The test pressing just sounds incredible. So that was $2 or $3. The last thing I bought, crate digging in America, was one of those ECM albums. This one, which is Tom Vandergelt. ECM is one of those labels which I tend to find pretty much everything is worth a listen.
Yeah.
I'll have favorites within the catalog, but they do sort of apply a good filter to their artists, and pretty much they're all worth giving some time to. And this one, I can't remember, I think it was $3. And this is lovely ambient jazz, almost vibraphone, acoustic guitar, double bass, flute, and soprano sax. But this was bought March of last year. We arrived in our first show in Pennsylvania on a Thursday afternoon. We'd heard various things that the whole COVID thing was really taking over the Western world, or about to. We were due to be on one of the rock cruises, Yes's Cruise to the Edge. We were going to do this run down the east coast of America and then get on the cruise. And some of the band and the crew were starting to get nervous about being on a cruise ship with this virus starting around. But it was a very, very strange to say. We arrived Thursday afternoon at the show in Allentown, and our promoter was there. He was the promoter for the next few shows. Said, like, the sold out shows Saturday and Sunday aren't happening. They've closed the theatre. Oh, right. And then a couple of hours after that, we heard it's not been announced, but the cruise isn't going to happen. By the time we were due to drive away from Allentown the next morning, Florida have closed all their venues. So we were left with 2 possible shows, I think, something like that. And we had to, between contacting our promoters and our booking agent in America, that we had to say, we've got to go home because we don't know what's going to happen. So we drove straight from Allentown, we drove to Philadelphia. And I then basically holed up in my hotel room in Philadelphia for, I forget how many hours on the phone because it's not that easy as just booking flights. When you're midway through a tour, we'd got a bus, we'd got equipment, we'd got merchandise. What's going to happen to all those things? I'd got a hire van to drive the band around. So probably started from when we arrived in Philadelphia, I don't know, late morning until well into the night, on the phone to the venues, the promoters, the busing company, our freight company, the merchandise company, our travel agents. So we managed to get people booked back on flights. So the band and the crew all flew back on the Saturday. Steve Hackett and his wife Joey got friends coming to see them, so we flew back 24 hours later. So to try and clear my head after all that fog for a couple of hours on Saturday afternoon, I think it was, after I'd waved goodbye to the crew and the band, I went out, and there's a store in Philadelphia I go to called Long in the Tooth Records. So that was my last tour crate digging until hopefully later this year when things kick off again.
Yeah, let's hope for the best.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, at the moment we're hopeful that, you know, if the vaccine rollout carries on and people aren't silly over the summer in terms of you know, maintaining some social distancing and the obvious things that should be second nature to people by now, but not everybody either thinks it doesn't apply to them or they're above it or whatever. So let's keep fingers crossed, because I say we should be playing Fairport Conventions, Cropredy Festival in August will be our first show since last March, and then following on from that we have the big UK tour in September, October. So we can cross fingers and hope for the best.
Yeah, for me it will probably be August in the US, just for a week, because like, you know, like the one other kind of issue that's coming up is now that like where there is some perspective and bands are kind of like booking shows again, or tours that were postponed are kind of like going to happen. It's going to be super crowded, and so like I can already see like quite a few conflicts for Pat and Tony to play Sigmund shows, even though they were, you know, because the Crimson is trying to play out again, and then there's other stuff that I can't talk about, but there's you know, there's quite a bit of activity.
Yeah, well, I was chatting with our American booking agent a couple of nights ago, and he's finding it doubly difficult trying to reschedule these dates the second time, because with the sort of more optimistic view now that things are going to start happening hopefully later in the year, so many tours are getting rebooked for next year. And because with Steve Hackett's show, we tend to play mostly sort of nice theatres, rather than we'll do the occasional sort of like big club show. We shy away from arena type venues, and like King Crimson, we like to play nice theatres. And because it's not just rock bands trying to get bookings for next year, it's also because it's theatres, it's theatrical productions and musical productions that will often book out a venue for a week or 2 weeks for rehearsals and then a run of shows. So our booking agent is frantically challenging these dates, and he's seeing balls. We're winning slowly, thank goodness, but it's taken a lot longer than it would normally take to put together a good American tour.
Hey, are you still playing the drums?
Very, very occasionally. It's always been a labor of love for me. I realized relatively early on, I did a few auditions for a few one very well-known band and one semi-well-known band back in the day, and didn't get either. This is going back as a teenager or in my early 20s. But with me, I took up the drums and I started playing drums to make music with other people. That's what I love about playing drums. And over the years, I've done rock stuff, I've done covers, I've done blues stuff, whatever. It's that interaction of making music with other people. Sitting by myself with a practice pad or a kit and playing rudiments and whatever bores the hell out of me. And I don't have the discipline to do that. So I kind of got good enough to get away with most things. But I haven't got the mental discipline to sit and do rudiments and things like that, which, you know, the top players do all the time and spend hours on every day to perfect their art. But yeah, I occasionally play. So I say it's covers bands and stuff like that. I've worked over the last sort of 18 months, worked with a musician called Paul McGuire, who's somebody who's moved up from Cambridge up to Orkney. He's a keyboard player and a writer, and I did an album with him. So right now, because of lockdown, my kit is over at his studio, an hour and a half, about as far away as you can be on Orkney and still be on the main island. My kit's down at the studio there, and I'm right up in the northwest tip of Orkney. So now things are starting to ease a little bit. And in terms of the islands in Scotland, we're down at what the government has said is the Scottish government says the lowest level until we're back at normality. So you can go out, you can have, I think as of Monday, you can have certain people in your house and you can eat at a restaurant or whatever. So I can hopefully go and retrieve my drum kit now, which has been marooned for a good while over the other side of the island.
And you will be able to go to a restaurant in the summer, probably.
Yeah, we could, prior to the restrictions went up again for a while. So you could actually have a meal at a cafe or a restaurant during the day for a while at the end of last year, I think. But that's reopening again now. And I mean, for Orkney, tourism is such a major part of the island economy. My wife Andrea is an independent artist, and she has a studio out in our garden that she planned for so long, and that was delayed. It was built. It was a wooden unit that was built and over the other side of the islands and couldn't be moved when the initial lockdown was on. So she actually got that in place sort of during the late summer last year, and she's been working from there. That's open as a studio and a working studio and a gallery as well. But you know, at the moment there's very few visitors because, you know, usually we'll have cruise ships. We'll have several big cruise ships a week up here. So we've had none of that, and we don't know when that's going to restart. Obviously, anybody travelling up from England wasn't allowed to do so for a while. For a while, even from Scottish mainland onto the islands was only out of necessity. So that's that whole easing thing. So we're hoping that, you know, her business will start to pick up over the summer as well as we start to welcome visitors back to Orkney.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck to all of us.
Yeah.
Hey, so let's do one last thing. I mean, I don't know how well organized your collection is, okay? Because I want you to do the opposite. I want you to just draw a random album from the shelves if you can.
Okay.
Just let's see what you not even look. Yeah.
I'm going to move the chair back slightly to reach.
Yes.
Which is in the middle somewhere. We've no idea what we're pulling out. We're pulling out the Pretenders' first album.
Wow.
Which is a goodie. I remember buying the Pretenders, the singles originally, which was Kid and Stop Your Sobbing and A Brass in Pocket, and this album came out. When was this? Sort of late 79 this came out.
Yeah.
So this was around, I remember this coming out around the same time as The Wall was very close to this. It was like late 79, and The Clash London Calling, which is another favorite. Yeah. So yes, the mystery album, the random album.
The random album is the Pretenders' first album.
Which is not, it could have been far more embarrassing than the Pretenders.
Hey, Adrian, so wonderful to talk with you.
It's been great to have a catch-up chat. It's been wonderful.
Yes.
And let's hope it's not too long and too far down the road where we're meeting at a venue somewhere and some music is being played live.
Well, the cruise ship next year, probably, if Steve is going.
We can't do it because the dates were changed. Remember I said all the problems that we had. We built a whole tour around about working down East Coast, doing the cruise, and then carrying on Midwest and out to West Coast. And then the date moved a week. And it's like, well, we're going to lose a week of our tour and we're going to have everybody sitting in Florida for a week. So
yeah, that's not going to work.
But Steve's already agreed that he will go back and do. Steve was gutted we couldn't do it, but we would lose so much in terms of the tour planning and stuff. But so 2023 he'll be definitely on the 2023 one.
Cool. But we're going to see each other before that.
I hope so.
Thank you so much, and talk to you very, very soon.
Take care, stay safe, and see you soon somewhere at a venue, coming to a venue, hopefully fairly soon near you.
Yes.
Take care, Marcus. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.